Welcome to everybody on YouTube out there. We're so thrilled. So welcome again. I always say welcome several times because I never know exactly when YouTube starts. So welcome to everybody who is joining us on YouTube for our unnamed, never to be named, mysterious Wednesday morning study class where you get to decide what we study. And I sent out the most recent list of what we're going to be studying to everybody I have on the list. Alan, I don't know if I have you on the list. You may not have got it. So today we're going to be doing a topic that I know is everybody's favorite, and that is Jews in comic books. So if you want the definitive book on Jews in comic book, it's this, From Krakow to Krypton by Ari Kaplan. So this is a wonderful book with lots of pictures and a whole bunch of stuff if you really want to get down in the nitty gritty. And it's a really fascinating subject, especially as comic books are now, well, at least movies and TVs wise, are bigger than ever. I may have stepped into a comic book store or two during my life in the last week. Well, not the last week because my son's had surgery, but before that. But when my wife came back from her trip to a wedding in Ohio, of course, she brought me back two comics that she knew I wanted that I was not willing to spend that kind of money. So it's a fun genre. And I hear, do we hear that? I think somebody may have two computers on in their house. Hello, everybody. Can I hear you? All right, we lost somebody. Perfect. So welcome, everybody. We're going to start with another book that I found that was great. And this is called The League of Regrettable Superheroes. This is a book on all the, many, not all, of the superheroes who didn't make it. Like, in other words, the comic was printed and nobody read that comic. For instance, Fat Man, Dr. Hormone, Bozo the Iron Man, The Eye, Amazing Man. So for every comic that succeeded, there was 20 or 30 or 50 that did not. So these are just some of the weird comics that nobody. Stardust, the Super Wizard. Never heard of him because nobody's heard of him. Zippo. That's a perfect name for a comic. B-Man. Never made it. So you would have never heard of a single one of these. Dial H for Hero. Captain Victory. 3D Man. The Sentinel. So for every comic that made it, there were many more that didn't. So we're going to go first to the beginnings of the genre. And of course, if you have any questions, let me know, because it really is a genre that in many ways mimics every single other genre for Jews, especially the movie world. So cinema is probably the best example that comics mimics. And why do I say that? Because there is always the same rule when it comes to Jews. We are very successful in places that are educated and open. And of course, America has been a very open and educated place. But we flock to what areas? What areas do Jews flock to? I mean, I'm sorry, not say. So what professional areas? The answer is whatever professional areas are open. That's the answer. It's always what professional areas are open. You see all the Jews who were money lenders in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries in Europe. Why? Because it was open. Jews could become money lenders. That was one of the few jobs. In America, you did not see a lot of bankers or advertising agents in the early 20th century who were Jewish because it wasn't open. In Hollywood, you saw Jews flock to the movie industry because it was considered a lowbrow, insignificant profession that nobody wanted to go in. Thomas Edison tried to monopolize it on the East Coast and keep Jews out, so they went west broke the monopoly, and it was completely open because nobody wanted to go into that business. Only people who were desperate. And poor educated people are desperate and educated. So it's the same thing with everything. If it's open and there's no restrictions or few restrictions, we're going to flock to that area because you can make a living. And that is exactly 100% what happened in the comic book world. So let's go over a little bit of the history, then we'll talk some specifics. It starts in 1933, so during the Depression. That's when the comic book genre begins. And it begins because, and this is one of the few things you can point to one guy, his name was Max Ginsberg. He went by the name Maxwell Charles M.C. Gaines. His son was also in the industry. And he had the brilliant idea of taking the comic strips from Saturday and Sunday comics and weekday comics that were in the newspapers and putting it into book form that people could read. So that was the basic idea, a very simple premise. Let me take the comics from the newspapers and put it into book form. And so in 1934, he came out with Famous Funnies, and that was a hit. And so he started to create more, as did rival comic book publishers. Now, what happened fairly quickly is they ran out of materials from the comics in the newspapers. So what did that mean? They had to hire more people to write. Now, all of the early comic book publishers were Jewish. Why? Because there were no restrictions. It was a new genre with no restrictions, number one. Number two, almost all of the writers early on and late, we're talking 80+%, were Jewish. Why were all the Jewish writers, why were all the writers in the early comic books Jewish? Because one, it was open, and two, publishing was not. So newspapers were not open to Jews. There was a very small percentage who were allowed to be Jewish. So you had all these writers who could not write for newspapers and could not write comics for newspapers because they were Jewish. So you had all of these 18, 19-year-old boys who were poor and starving. Why? Because it was the Depression and finding jobs was difficult. And this was an area that was open. So almost all, early on it was higher than 80%. As time go on. So all of the early writers in the 1930s and comic book illustrators were Jewish. And there were no restrictions because it was not considered a popular area, and two, because all the publishers were Jewish. So it made it easy. Larry.
Rabbi, question. I hear an echo there, right?
Do you hear from me?
I'm not sure if it's...
It may be for me. I had some problems earlier with this. It must be for me because you and I are the only ones on. Okay, let's try it over here. Is that better?
Could you hear me now?
Yeah.
Still a little bit of an echo, but the comic funnies that were in the newspapers then, were they not done by the daily ones or ones that came out each day or in the Sunday newspapers as we used to see them? Were they not done by Jewish?
No, very few. There were limits. I mean, there's always going to be one or two. There were one or two, but they had quotas. And it was also during the Depression. So there were not, I mean, jobs were very tough to find. So it was easy to put these quotas on. So there were a couple of them. But by and large, there were quotas in most. By the 30s, there were no quotas, I think, in hospitals. That had been taken care of. There were no quotas in terms of Hollywood, obviously, except for certain areas like lead actors. But banking and advertising, there were quotas everywhere.
Was the audience predominantly children then, or young people?
Yes, it was predominantly kids still. Yeah. I mean, there were adults who read it too. There were adults also who read it, but it became pretty quickly for young people. But there were adults, obviously the same adults who were reading the comic strips, but I think probably kids were the biggest ones. But again, it was still not a huge, I mean, it was popular, but it's going to be a few years before it becomes mega popular as we know it. I mean, as we know it today, it's going to be a long time. But it became pretty popular. You know, comics were selling out. They had Jews doing, I mean, you're writing tons of book. I mean, there were tons of them coming out. And so they're not paying the writers a lot of money. The writers are making just enough to make a living. They're not making, you know, lots of money. Very famously, we'll talk about this, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster created Superman, got like $140, and that was it. Until we'll talk about how they got some money later on. But, you know, there were also no, what's the word? When you, when it comes to infringement.
Copyright.
Copyright. Thank you. My mind. Very little copyright. So you could not go and put Tarzan and Buck Rogers in a comic book unless you had permission. But you could go and create Gregor, the lost man from America who was raised by wolves in the jungles of, you know, South America. And it's the exact same thing almost, but slightly different. That was done everywhere. So whenever you saw a popular character, all the other publishers would come up with almost exactly the same character with some just minor differences, just enough so they wouldn't get sued. That happens to this day as well. You know, even in comic books, the major comic books, they find the Ant-Man. He can shrink and he's still strong and brilliant. So on the other side, they have the Atom, who is brilliant and can shrink. But one's the Atom and one is the Ant-Man. So they're completely different, even though they're very similar. And so this was already gone. This is a tradition in comic books that it always goes on this way. But the big change, the first big change in comics came about 4 or 5 years later. And when Shuster and Siegel, two struggling young boys who were Jewish, created, of course, Action Comics #1. And in Action Comics #1, by the way, if any of you have this in an attic in mint condition, can I buy it from you for $10? So I may show that in a second. And it became a huge hit. The Man of Steel became a big hit. So of course, everybody else started creating comics with these supermen, men with superpowers. And again, to this day, he is the most famous. And this period where Superman comes out is called the Golden Age of comics. This is the 1930s and 40s. This is when it all begins. This is where you get Superman, and then later on, of course, Batman, Captain America, some of the greats. And if you're wondering which ones were created by Jews of all the famous 1930s and 40s comics, have you ever heard of Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman? Those are the only two not created by Jews. Those two. Every single other popular one is Jewish in its origin. Not the character, but the people who wrote it. So it's a trivia question. Two most popular non-comics characters not created by Jews, Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman. And so, ironically, of course, Wonder Woman is played by a Jewish woman in today's cinema, but she was not created by. So they created these comics, and a lot of it had to do with who these people were. So who were the people creating them really affected the comics. Why? Well, let's look at it. There was anti-Semitism, a lot more in the 30s than there was in the 20s because obviously of the Depression. And so the idea of storytelling, the idea of being a Jewish immigrant, of being an outsider, of being someone who needs a secret identity, of boys who are not very tall or strong for their age, and they're taught by their parents to be bookworms and study. They want to be strong and powerful And how they do this, they have a secret identity, a separate identity. And that's what we see in these comic books. We see these ideas of Jewish immigration issues, issues with being bullied. And then all of these, or a lot of these comic book heroes and villains are what field are they in? They're scientists. They're scientists, are really bright men. So not only is Superman strong, but he's really smart. Batman, who does not have any superpowers except that he's brilliant. And so for groups of guys who were taught how important it was to be smart, these were perfect characters for them. Now remember, they literally have the option of working in comics or maybe working in sweatshops. And so they've all dropped out of college because of the Depression or weren't able to go. Whereas if they'd been like my grandfather, he was born in 1913. So at 15, he was planning to go to college in a year or two, and then the Depression hits and he never goes to college. And the same thing for all these kids. So, and so it's very, very simple that these people went to these areas because it was open to them. And it's really incredible to see how you can see stories through them. Now, what are some of the more famous characters that can be seen to be Jewish? Because they, remember, like Hollywood, they're not trying to be overtly Jewish. They don't want anybody to know these characters are Jewish. There will not be a Jewish comic book character until the 1960s. Overtly.
Who was that?
The Thing. Part of the Fantastic Four.
No.
But he's not going to be known to be Jewish for a few years. So, but Superman obviously is the most famous with Jewish traits. Why? Let's think about the Superman story. He is from a planet that is going to die. His father is a scientist named Jor-El. El is the name of God in the Bible. His name is Kal-El, which means kind of the voice of God. And his father is telling everybody the planet is going to be destroyed. Nobody listens, so he sends his son, with his wife and him, send his son in a space capsule to another planet to be raised by somebody else. This is the most obvious Jewish laced story of all times because it completely follows the story of Moses. And I think everybody knows this. This is the story of Moses. Moses is then brought up by another woman who has to hide who he is. She has to hide the fact that he's an alien, just as Pharaoh's daughter had to hide the fact that Moses was Jewish or Hebrew. Now, there's debates as to whether Moses knew he was a Hebrew growing up. But in the case of Superman, obviously he had to know he was something different because of his strength. So remember, this is the 1930s as well. This is when the Nazis are marching through cities in parades where people are celebrating them. This is the age of Father Coughlin, of course, who was an ardent anti-Semite, who of course became very famous as a Jew hater. So during this time, you have Superman who comes out. He is wearing glasses and pretending to be somebody he isn't his whole life. But yet he is super. He is strong. He is what Jews want to be. And he is also incredibly kind and sophisticated. And it's in love with one woman, which is a very nice thing to do. And so he is considered, I mean, that story, his origin story, of course, is the most famous. But of course, then things change because World War II starts. And now Jewish comic book writers have the perfect villain. You couldn't use the Nazis as the villain too much because they were very popular in America. But now that we're at war with the Nazis, guess who the villain is going to be in the comic books? It's going to be the Nazis, obviously. And so guess who goes to war? All the comic strip superheroes go to war. There's a very famous comic where Superman goes, goes into sign up to be in the military. He signs up to go to war, and he fails his exam. Does anybody guess why he fails the exam? He actually fails his exam because when he's reading when he's doing the reading test, he gets every single one wrong. He gets every letter wrong because he's accidentally looking through the wall at the reading test in the next room. So he fails his physical exam. That's an actual comic book where that happens. So, but everybody goes to war. But if you're going to war, you also need specific heroes for war. And the most famous comic book hero of the war is not probably the Man of Steel. It is Captain America, who is probably number 2 or a close second for the most. He's close second because he's not quite as famous as Superman, although now he's probably as famous because of the movies. Why is he? He is the perfect Jewish hero for the war. Absolutely. Why? What is who knows his origin story? Basically, it is the military is looking to test a super serum and on somebody to be the new, face of the war. And so they bring in volunteers for this. And again, it was really well done in the movies, pretty accurate actually to how it goes. And they don't pick the strong WASP guys to take the super serum. Who do they choose? They choose the really thin, weak, sickly Jewish boy who's intelligent, and he is chosen for the super serum. He's not Jewish. Now, who creates the super serum? It is a German scientist who has escaped Germany. Is he Jewish in the book? No. But is he Jewish in the book? Of course he is. His name is Professor Reinstein or Reinstein. Does that sound like anybody you heard of?
Einstein.
Reinstein?
Einstein.
It's Einstein, obviously. But he's not Jewish in the book. And he picks the little, small, thin boy, and he becomes Captain America. Steve Rogers. Obviously, he's not Jewish. Steve Rogers is not a Jewish name. And Steve Rogers is pitted against the Nazis, but they really need somebody else besides Hitler, so they create the Red Skull. And so Superman and Captain America and all these heroes are off fighting the Nazis, and it is also very famously known that none other than Nazi Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels denounced Superman as being Jewish over and over again. He hated Superman. So that's how big Superman had become, that Goebbels is denouncing him in the middle of the war. So this is how the comic book industry blew up in the 30s and 40s, and it becomes very popular. It's not as popular like movies or anything like that, but still very popular.
Who created the Captain America?
What Captain America was created by, I think it was Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who are going to do a bunch of others in the 60s. Especially Jack Kirby. So obviously 2 Jewish boys. Almost all of them are Jewish except for, again, Captain Marvel. You may know Captain Marvel, Shazam, and Wonder Woman. So now after the war, the comic books start to lose steam. And that was mostly because people started to think that comic books were bad for children. So you know all the things that happened after the war. You have the anti-communist groups, you have the anti-everything groups, and they're searching for people to destroy. They're blackballing people left and right. This is what's happening after World War II, and the comic book industry gets caught in this. And there are some comics that change. They get rid of the Bible stories. They get rid of the overtly educational stuff. They start having Yiddish words, and they start having comics like Tales from the Crypt and comics like that, horror comics, scary comics that are pretty popular with kids, but not popular with the people who have nothing to do but ruin other people. And so basically, Bill Gaines, who was Max Gaines' son, was the biggest distributor, got rid of all the educational comics. And then by the 50s, comics were all but dead, except for comics like Mad Magazine, which was started by the Gaines as well, which obviously continues to this day. So except for comic fun, the comic book industry didn't die. It just was, basically on a ventilator in the 50s. There were books that came out that talked about how terrible they were. The most famous was The Seduction of the Innocent by psychologist Frederick Wertham, who after 7 years studying the effects of comic books on kids, decided that comic books contribute to juvenile delinquency, and they were probably, but it just seems like 7 years is a long time to study this, but that's just me. So if 7 years, then after 7 years you say they're no problem, they're okay, you're not going to make any money. And
There's
so
always that stereotypical picture of the kid in school, and he's got his book open, and inside the book,
right,
got a comic book, and the teacher doesn't know that he's reading the comic book instead of the textbook.
Exactly. And that's still going on. I mean,
comics, yeah.
There were still comics in the 50s. It was just not the same amount being produced as in the 40s and 30s. And again, it was mostly the innocent ones and Mad Magazine. It wasn't the superhero ones, but they were still being out there. Now, Mad Magazine, of course, became really famous and is still around today. But by 1954, there were subcommittees, illustrator, and people were going to court. So basically, it was all killed until the 1960s. So in the 1960s, we still had, Archie and those kinds of comics. But by the 1960s, things had changed again. And then comics relate to the changes of the day. And the 60s, we know, is very different than the 70s, because the 60s were going to war. Things are changing. You've got John F. Kennedy beats Nixon to become president. You've got all of these things going on. You've got civil rights. And so comics is about to explode again. And it all happens in 1961. Comics are basically dead. A lot of, in terms of superhero comics, and a lot of the other ones are fading away. But in 1961, a man named Stan Lee and Jack Kirby develop a new comic. And Stan Lee, of course, is probably the most famous comic book artist of all time. He died just a few years ago. Have any of you seen the Marvel movies? Iron Man, Avengers, Captain America, Spider-Man. He has a cameo in every single one of them until he died in his 90s. So he just died like 2 years ago. So he and Jack Kirby, and he wasn't as well known as Jack Kirby, but he was about to leave because they weren't making money. He was asked by the head of Timely Comics, a guy named Martin Goodman, obviously Jewish, to create some new comic book superheroes that were more relatable to the day. And the first one they created was the Fantastic Four. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Fantastic Four. Anybody heard of the Fantastic Four?
Yeah.
This is the first. I'm going to put it up here 1 second. I forgot. The first of the new comic books that were going to change the world. Now let me see here if I'm going to put the first one up.
So that's the first time that the superheroes got together? Is that why it changed?
Exactly. Well, no, it's not the first time at all. No, in fact, they were specifically asked. Sorry, I'm just putting this on screen share. He was specifically asked to find a comic book team up like the Justice League. You know, Batman and Superman had gotten together with Wonder Woman already. And they were still around. And so this is the comic he came up with, Fantastic Four. If you have this comic in mint condition, you can get a lot of money. So go back, anybody grew up in the 60s. So in it, you will see 4 characters. Invisible Girl, the Torch, the Thing, and Mr. Fantastic. This starts a revolution in comics again, just like Superman did in 1938 and was done with the first comic in 1933 and was done with Captain America for World War II. This is another major milestone. It is a group of friends, 2 scientists, a woman and a man. Her brother and his best friend get caught up in space energy and they are transformed. One can stretch. One can become fire and shoot fire. Another can become invisible and create force fields. And the Thing, who is a rock man. He can't change. It's not like the Hulk, he changes. He's always a rock man. And so they are a new type of superhero because they are not like everyone else and not adored. They are strange. And it fits the times. They are outsiders. You have a guy who looks like a rock. You have a guy who can fly and shoots fire. This is a new idea. This is a new age going with what's going on. They were not happy like Superman. The guy who's a rock monster is depressed because he is a rock monster. It's really hard to date if you're a rock monster. That's all I'm thinking. And they're controlling their powers. They're having trouble with finances. You know, the Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Woman have trouble with the relationship. So they are the metaphor of what's going on in the world of the day. They are outsiders who are sometimes popular and sometimes not. Mr. Fantastic is the smartest man on earth. So he's also brilliant, a scientist. What a coincidence. Let me show you a picture of the Thing up close.
He's the Jewish one.
He's the Jewish one.
Does he become known as Jewish?
He does later on, yes. In fact, there's a very famous comic. I see. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Images. Let's see. Here we go. I'll get one from the movies.
Who is their enemy?
Their enemy is Dr. Doom, who is a Nazi-type character from Eastern Europe who is a brilliant scientist who gets caught up in the same radiation. Oops, I mean, that's not one. he gets caught up in the same radiation and ends up with even stronger superpowers. Let me get one from I'll get one from the comics. There you go.
So you think he represents the Soviet Union to some extent? Or?
Some extent, yes. In fact, more than some extent. He's, Eastern European. He's the, he is a bad guy through and through. Here is the Thing. That's him right here. And one of my favorite comics, he is fighting, let's see, he is fighting a, let's see if I can find that comic. He's fighting like a sewage monster. And they're fighting, and it's somehow, the Thing says like, oh, I'm Jewish. And the sewage monster says, you're Jewish? Funny, you don't look Jewish. Which is a really funny quote because he's a rock monster. Of course he doesn't look Jewish. He's a rock monster. So of course he doesn't look Jewish. So, but this is not the ultimate because there are more. This is going to become the Marvel Age or the Silver Age of comics where these same guys, especially Kirby and Stan Lee, are going to come up with a lot of characters. The most famous is going to be Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, and then another group that is even more linked to Jews, and that is going to be a group called the X-Men. Now, who are the X-Men? I should have got these up before, but I forgot to do it. So who are the X-Men? X-Men are a different breed of human being. And I'm going to put them up. The X-Men are not given their powers because of an accident, like Fantastic Four. They're not given their powers because of a super serum, like Captain America. They're not given their powers because they're aliens from another world. They are mutants. That means they are born different. They are genetically different. This is not the X-Men #1. This is an old comic. Oh, maybe this is, no, it's not #1. But you'll see on this one, you have a guy with wings, Angel. You have a guy who has big feet and is, kind of like an animal, almost like a gorilla. You've got a guy who's got lasers for eyes. You got a guy who can turn into snow and make you ice. You got a woman back here who has telekinesis, the power of the mind. And the leader is a guy named Professor X, who is a genius who can read minds and can control minds. And he sits in a chair because he can't walk because he was hit. That's another origin story. And these are the X-Men. Why are these Jewish? Because these are the genetic outcasts. They are not loved by people. They are feared and hated because they are genetically different. Genetically different. Sound familiar? It is akin to the African American situation in the 60s, the Jewish situation. You're an outsider, feared and hated, sometimes even admired, but often people are jealous. And they are a team of outsiders who go to a special school for gifted youth. And the X-Men are still very popular today. They're in the movies and so forth. But their enemy, their #1 enemy is Magneto. Magneto has the power to control metal. But more importantly for us, why does he hate the world? He hates the world for 2 reasons. One, because the world hates mutants, because he's a mutant. He was the best friend of the good guy. He's a mutant, but more importantly, he hates the world because he is a Holocaust survivor. He survived the camps, and he hates the world. He thought the world was getting better, but now the world hates mutants. They're going after mutants. In some cases, like Nazis went after Jews. So he wants to destroy all the people who are trying to destroy mutants, where his best friend, Professor X, is trying to find a way for mutants and human beings to live together. It is a much different story than all the other stories that we've seen because, again, this is about a group of people who are, in many cases, hated by the people they're protecting. And of course, this is the X-Men. Now, Spider-Man will become more popular than any of them. Spider-Man will be the most popular of all the Marvel heroes. And he is also very interesting. He's very similar to Captain America. He is poor. His parents died. He's being raised by his uncle and aunt who are always striving to make rent or pay for their mortgage. He's a brilliant teenager who's thin and weak. And then all of a sudden he gets bitten by a radioactive spider and he has the power of a spider. But he is not revered. He is hated by people because the newspaper publisher of the time just decides to hate him. And so he spends the whole time reading about how terrible he is, no matter how many people he saves. That is Spider-Man. You've probably heard of Spider-Man, I imagine. Has everybody heard of Spider-Man? Okay, he's pretty famous. Yes, exactly. Alan did a good image of Spider-Man. Is not Jewish, but in reality, of course, he's Jewish. He's a brilliant young man who is weak and he's being pushed around. He never gets the girl. And then all of a sudden he's bitten by a radioactive spider and he's what every science genius Jewish boy wants is to be bitten by a radioactive spider and become a superhero. But even though he's a superhero, he's still always broke. Why? Because the 60s superheroes are more realistic in some ways, not in that they're superpowers, but they're struggling with money. He's always struggling with money. Why? Because he's trying to study. He's got a part-time job and he's trying to go to school and help his aunt. So he's got no time to make money, unlike Batman, who is a billionaire. So it's a really different way of looking at comics. So those are the two major ages would be the Silver Age and the Golden Age, and then the Silver Age of comics. So that's the 60s, 30s through the 60s. Any questions so far?
Did the audience change now for more adults? Are the stories getting more sophisticated?
They are getting more sophisticated, but it's still mostly boys and boys and men in their early 20s. Flossie.
When you were talking about after the war with the 1950s, how they felt, did McCarthyism make a difference?
Huge difference. That was the biggest anti-everything there was. That was the crescendo of this hate movement where we're going to get rid of people who are different than us. So that affected everything. I don't think people my age understand how much he affected the world and what was going to come later on. And again, you see it in every field. I mean, again, you're trying to target a certain group of people for whatever reason and destroy them. And so, yes, that had a huge impact on everything, including the industry. I mean, it became just, they still had Batman and Superman, but they were not the serious. They were more fun-loving, and you had the fun comics, but nothing with the serious issues of the day. The comics in the 60s are about what's going on. They're about Vietnam and civil rights and women's rights and being different and being alienated and suffering. So it's a very different type of comic book that's being written. But everything else is changing too. As we talked about, CBS got rid of the Andy Griffith Show and Gomer Pyle and put in MASH, All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore, later on Maude. So everything is changing to be more serious, more up to date.
How McCarthy went after the film industry. Did they do much going after a lot of the producers of the comics since they were Jewish? Or that?
No, he didn't go after comics very much, I don't think. Remember, the comic book industry by the 50s is still very small. It's not considered this all-encompassing. So, it would have been like, going after a small, instead of going after McDonald's, you're going after a local hamburger place. I mean, you're not going to make money. You're not going to make the headlines going after Superman, So it was not, but there were, I mean, again, there were subcommittees, there were books, other people were going after them. That was more child issues, like child endangerment issues. I don't even know if he spoke about the comics. He might have. I don't know. We have to look that up. That's a good question.
Thank you.
But the 70s would continue the trend of the 60s, but you then started to have overt Jewish characters. The Thing came out as Jewish, a very super popular character called Kitty Pryde, who was a girl who could make herself dematerialize, became a super popular character, and she was like the girl next door that all the boys fell in love with who were reading comic books, and she was Jewish. She had a Star of David necklace.
Wow.
So in the 70s, you also had the same thing. I mean, the popularity was great because you had the X-Men as outsiders. You had new comics. They were dealing with issues of the day. They were becoming more popular, so the art is a lot more vivid. And then the 80s has another change to the comic book world. And this is where we get to more relevant comics that aren't superhero necessarily. Like the superheroes were the most popular, but you had Archie and all those things. But you had something called the graphic novel. I don't know if you know what a graphic novel is. It's like a novel, a comic book novel. So it's not like a little thin piece of paper. It's an actual book with a long story in comic book form. I should have brought one.
When Spiegelman speaks.
Exactly. That became the most prominent. So you had these books coming out, and the first one was not Spiegelman, was one by Will Eisner, who's one of the most famous comic book artists of all time. He wrote something called A Contract with God about a pious Jew who gives up Judaism when his daughter dies. Another guy named Harvey Pecker continued to write something called American Splendor about this Jewish nebbish guy who it's just about his life and how the burdens of life, and he doesn't have friends, and he's kind of, and he's just trying to find a way in the world as this regular guy who happens to be a comic book artist. So realistic comics, along with the superhero comic books that started to deal with real issues, like what would superheroes be like in reality? Like Batman might be some sort of sociopath. Superman could destroy the world if he wanted. What if he wasn't such a nice guy? What are the issues that real heroes would face? What are the psychological issues they would face? How brutal would they be? What would the governments do to try and curtail them or use them for their purposes? Wouldn't it be great to have superhero assassins? So, and then in the height, you had probably the most well-regarded of all of them, and that, of course, is Mouse, or Moss, depending how you pronounce it, and which is very apropos today because it was just banned in a school district in Kentucky, I think, or Tennessee. So, whenever you ban something, the sales are going to go up. So my wife had never, as I mentioned, she never heard of these two comic books or graphic novels, but when she saw that they were being banned, she went out and bought them, as any good Jewish woman would. Then I reread them. So I've read them a couple times, but it is a beautifully written and penned comic book about the Holocaust. There are two stories in it. It's a story about a Holocaust and a story about his son and a relationship with his father, who is a Holocaust survivor. And both are very poignant. It's not only about the Holocaust, it's about what it did to this man and how it affected his relationship with his son, who's now an adult, and all the issues his father has. But more than that, it also puts Jews as mice. The Jews are mice in the comic strip. The Nazis are, of course, cats, and the Poles are pigs. So it's a comic book. It's meant for kids to teach them how to understand the Holocaust. And it became the first and only graphic novel or comic book to win a Pulitzer Prize. And it's a really beautiful story about how this guy tries to create a relationship with his father, who has a lot of idiosyncrasies and is generally a good man, but the Holocaust had a profound effect on him, but it had a profound effect on his son, who may not have had the relationship with his father he wanted because of what his father endured. The same thing with his mother, who had already passed away, but what she endured, and obviously I don't want to tell the story, but I believe she commits suicide because of her memories of the Holocaust, and he has to deal with this, and how his wife is trying to understand what's going on with him because of all these things, and how his father's girlfriend or new wife is trying to understand what he's like. And so it's a really strange, haunting, and beautifully written book that, again, received a lot of notice. Jeff.
Why is there such a movement like in Tennessee to ban the book?
Well, officially, it's because there's nudity, in it, because obviously the Holocaust, when they're at the camps, and it's graphic and violent. So, and again, it's just one area, but I think it speaks to a larger, the idea of book banning, which for years it was considered a cultural hazard, is now gaining steam, and you hear the phrase book banning as becoming okay now, because what I think is, smut must be. So it's a real issue in our world, and when and we're not talking about, magazines from Hugh Hefner. We're talking about a graphic novel about, yes, Jeff and Flossie, you're competing with each other.
Okay,
Then I'm going with Flossie.
go ahead.
No, Jeff, I was kidding. Go ahead.
No. That turned into a book banning, and then shortly after that, a church sponsored a book burning.
Yeah, we had that. We've seen it in a couple places. I think they did something like that at Georgia Southern a few years ago. So, and these are terrible. I mean, again, we understand the implications, but unfortunately, not everybody does. Flossie.
We're part of a book group that just read Book Thief.
The Book Thief. I haven't read it, but I hear it's really good.
Take a chance. It's wonderful. And the interesting thing, it started off as a young adult book. And at least in the book group, they brought up it is required reading in a lot of schools.
Yeah. Oh, good.
And it talks about book burning and banning, and it's quite popular. That, and I think we said The Diary of a Young Girl are two of the most popular books for teenagers.
Yeah, and again, it's important because for us, the idea of book banning and book burning is just, it sends, electricity up our spine whenever we just hear the phrase.
Side of the equation is equally as disturbing, is that what's not book burning, what's being put into books.
Yeah.
For some reason, Texas has the largest publishing monopoly on textbooks.
Oh yeah, I worked with an organization for years fighting it when I was in Texas.
Yeah, apparently because and publishers, obviously, they went to Texas to buy books for the entire state, as I understand it.
The whole state and all the other states as well, because small states like Nebraska and and Kansas that didn't have the.
Right, so they would have a monopoly and they would be able to publish them at more reasonable prices. And then the other school districts around the United States who would be looking for books, would be looking for textbooks, and they would take the Texas version, of which a lot of it had in it, creationism versus Darwinism, the emphasis and those kinds of things on it. So it's the other end, obviously, that's equally as troublesome now. What's
Yeah, and again, you have to understand, to get on the committee, to be the one to, you're handpicked for this committee, and so anybody can get, to get these people on the committee to select and edit the books, and they are not very knowledgeable. They just have agendas, and they are very specific. They wanted to get rid of,
Mark
they took
Twain?
Thomas Jefferson out of certain history books.
Yeah, Mark Twain, they didn't like.
Because Thomas Jefferson coined the term separation of church and state.
Right.
In science, as they give, well, Darwinism is one option, but you got to have another option to compare it to. So let's create this other option, because scientists, they're divided as to which one is correct, whereas 99.9% of scientists believe in this one. And so there's a lot of issues with that, a lot of issues. And again, how you tell the story is very important, and what you decide to put in. And so, you can easily, put civil rights as a very short chapter. Flossie.
You're saying what you put in, or the big issue is what you take out.
Yeah, and it's not taking out, it's if you don't put it in there first place, right?
This is
Exactly. It's what you, and you can do it very easily, and it's about making subtle changes. Without anybody looking.
Very differently, because they don't want children to see the real world.
Right. Or they wanted children to see the world they want them to see.
That's a good way to put it.
This
Right.
the black.
Yes, Flossie.
Oh, sorry.
Just one quick question. I have your list here of class sessions coming up in the future. Is there any way for July 13th, great places for Jewish travel? We're going to be out of the country, and often.
Perfect.
Well, great, but they don't show it in Ireland. I'm sorry, you're not out there.
So you want to lead the class now then?
I want to bring everyone with me here. Is there any way to do that a little later?
Sure. When would you like to move that to?
Well, if you want to do it a week later.
All right, we'll do that on July 20th.
All right, thank you. And if you're moving it, how
I
about,
put places great for Jewish.
June 29th, and that one be to the week after the Jewish travel? Those so appeal to me, but we won't be around.
All right, perfect. All right, so we switched that, no worries. And then, all right, so next week we're going to do Jewish current events.
We'll be here for it, yeah.
And we'll deal with a little bit with what on Israel, what's in Europe. Noel, do you have a question, Noel?
Yes, I want to say something to Genevieve. Can she unmute?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. What's up?
Can she unmute?
Hi.
Oh, I love your surroundings, if it's a room or whatever. It's so beautiful.
Oh,
And
yeah.
you seem so knowledgeable. Are you an educator?
No, but I do homeschool my children, which it was an interesting subject we were just talking about, because I was just thinking, I have shown my children, even though I don't show them a lot of violent things, obviously, but I do show them the real stuff of slavery and Holocaust, like the boy in the striped pajamas and stuff like that, so they can have empathy for what the people have gone through.
Yeah, and again, it's not about reading Moss to my 5-year-old daughter. It's always got to be age appropriate. But I agree. Again, and just the idea of it's very hard, I imagine, to raise kids these days. That's why I'm letting my wife do it instead of me.
Here's my real boring background.
And she has a really cool job. If you want to tell them what you
have
do.
Beautiful hair.
And she's got an awesome job.
Hair is beautiful.
Yeah, I work in film and television. I work in location. So basically, I'm the one that helps shut down the street, pay the officers, make sure all the background equipment is there as far as like tent, trash is taken care of, bathrooms. There's more to pay all the location owners and contracts. Some of the boring stuff of behind the scenes.
That's exciting. So, for instance, she gets to choose where they're filming. So,
well, not completely accurate. The director picks. We just make the negotiations and make sure.
You give them options, right?
Yes. Yeah, we give them options.
All right.
Rabbi, I wanted to mention two things. One is the Black experience in comics. A couple of years ago, the Black Panther created quite a sensation when they came up with a black superhero. And a story about, they had this enormous piece of metal of some sort. I don't remember exactly what it was called.
Vibranium.
Vibranium. Yeah, and trying to emphasize the black superhero part of it.
Yeah, and I think they're going, the comic book industry has exploded because of the movies that came out, because technology finally caught up. The first big one was a guy named Blade, who was a vampire hunter. So they did a movie like that, didn't realize it was going to be very popular. It was. Then they did the X-Men, which became very popular. And then they decided to do a movie with one of the all-time most popular comics, and that was Spider-Man. Now, obviously, they'd done the Superman and Batman in the 80s. The Batman in the 80s really started it. So they did the Spider-Man one, and it blew up and was a major, major hit. I think it made like 400 million in the US, which at the time was like third or fourth all time. And that kind of shot off, and then now they've done the other. So they're trying to get all the genres. So they wanted a woman, female character. So obviously Wonder Woman was for DC. And for Marvel, they decided to create the Captain Marvel character, which became a big hit.
Yeah.
But they wanted an African-American hero. Obviously, they had them already, but they wanted a major one. And so with a African-American director, where most of the cast would be African-American, the bad guy would be African-American. And so they came up with, obviously, Black Panther, which was kind of it wasn't the most famous of any African-American, but that's the one they chose. And that became a huge hit, over $1 billion worldwide. I don't know if any of you ever went to a theater. I remember going to the theater, and it was like 5 Black Panthers showing at one time and 2 or 3 other movies. And I'd already seen it. And you go in, and every theater was completely packed with Black Panther. It was so popular. And so, unfortunately, the main character in the movie died recently, a few years ago. So he died. He had cancer. He died like a year or two after it came out. After he was in another movie or two, that character, and after the last one came out. Yeah. So they're filming another one, but they're not. I think they're going to use a woman. So, it's about trying to get people. Like anything else, you want to make money, you open it up to all people, and that's what they're doing. So they now had some gay characters, although they haven't been the lead characters. It's a really interesting dilemma that Hollywood faces, because they make more money with movies outside of the U.S. than in the U.S. A lot more. And the biggest markets are places like China. And India is a big market. You got the Middle East, you got Europe. So American sensibilities. So if you have main gay characters, China's going to say you can't have that movie here. If you have a minor scene with gay characters, it can be edited out. Like in the recent movie, they wanted the skyline, or like a building taken out from New York. Like there's one of the main buildings in New York, and China said you can't have that building in a movie, so just take it out to show the movie in China. And the movie studio said no. And by saying no, they lost about probably $300 or $400 million. So it's that balance of, and we'll finish with Larry.
Yeah, I just want to mention 2 other things. One is that Broadway seems also to embrace comic books, and that a lot of them are musicals. You see, like musicals and Annie and those kind of things. And
yeah.
Captured Charlie Brown, of course, and those things. But as another topic, I came across something that was really interesting, and it's a little bit disturbing, and that is there's a movie out called Blue Box. I don't know if you've heard of it, but Blue Box alludes to the box that we all used to have in the pushka, if you want to remember it as the pushka, where you put money in it.
Right.
To put money in the Jewish National Fund.
Right.
Well, apparently, the people now that started the Jewish National Fund, which is around 1900 or so, the idea of populating Israel with Jewish people, by putting forests in areas of different lands. It's a very disturbing film. There's a lot of YouTube stuff on it. I don't know whether to see both sides of it.
I until now I never heard of it. I just looked it up, and it's I can see it's a documentary on Rotten Tomatoes. It only has 2 reviews, and both are good.
But there's a couple of YouTube conversations between,
About
which we could watch privately, and then maybe just get a relation to it. It's because it's actually
that would be interesting. Yeah, I'll check that out.
check out the 2 books.
Yeah, because there's such anti-Israel sentiment in the world. So
Well, these are Jewish people, and actually they are grandson or the great grandson of the founder.
oh really? Wow,
Which makes it even more startling. That
Yes.
they are very.
that is.
Have a look.
I'll look it up.
Yeah, it's
And we'll finish with. I'm sorry, Larry. I'm sorry for interrupting. You're coming in and out, so it's hard to. I don't know if you.
Like this.
Could everybody hear Larry there, or was it just me? Is it coming in?
No, he's breaking up.
Okay, so I didn't know if you'd stop. So So Larry, did you finish? Sorry, I went.
Yeah, Blue Box.
Have you seen it yourself?
No, I haven't seen the film, but I've seen the interviews on television
Okay,
just recently on YouTube.
that may be something to bring here. Flossie.
Larry's sound problem might be something about reflecting off where he's talking into. So there might be some bounce back between his
Okay, so maybe talking about.
microphone or something on the desk.
Yeah, because before I heard him fine.
On the plus side, we saw the other night on Netflix, Jewish Broadway. I don't know what any, did you see it, Rabbi?
I did not, but I know Tim taught a course on it.
Well, this was very good. It is making the route to Jewish film festivals around the country.
Okay, that would be awesome.
And I spoke to Rabbi Cantor about it because he's so into theater. And he said he is going around talking about it, that it's on Netflix, and it's quite good.
And that might be something to talk about when you want to add Jewish Broadway. That is something I'm definitely not that knowledgeable about, but I'm happy to look it up. In
Okay.
fact, we may have Tim's notes somewhere.
Oh, well, or bring Tim back to talk about it.
Right. I mean, obviously I know a few things like everybody else. I know, Leonard Bernstein is, and
Well, you could even ask if you want Rabbi Cantor to do it with you.
that's a good idea. I'll see.
He's very learned on it.
And I know they're doing they're doing a movie on Leonard Bernstein. I know that. That's fine. All right. So pleasure as always.
Rabbi?
Yes. Is that Arlene?
No.
Did we lose somebody? Was that Jane?
No.
Who was speaking? I heard somebody say something. Somebody say okay, maybe it's just me. I'm hearing things. All right, perfect. Hearing things on.
Also.
Well, you guys stay safe. Thank
too,
you so
Rabbi.
much, and we'll see you next week. And again, if you guys feel comfortable doing, start doing the classes in person, just let me know. I'm happy to come out there anytime, and outside or inside, depending on what people are comfortable. So you just let me know.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So
Bye-bye.
enjoy the comic books. I'm sure you're going to read. You're going to, and remember, you all have homework. You're going to look for me as a gift: Superman 1, Batman 1,
$10.
Captain America 1, Spider-Man 1, Fantastic Four 1. Any of those.
Yes,
My birthday's coming up, and preferably in mint condition. All right, guys, stay safe.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.